Good morning, everyone, and welcome to episode 2. Last week I had named this Turnip's Review, but that sort of stepped on the toes of one of my friends who has named his. Ooh. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting double volume. I haven't done this before. So, somewhere. There it is.
If you have the stream up on YouTube, you're going to
Yeah.
have to mute that.
Yeah, I didn't realize that just opened. Sorry. Alright, there we go. Couldn't go without at least some issue. Anyways, yes, last week this was called Turnip's Review. We discussed Roe versus Wade and the Supreme Court ruling dealing with it. However, my friend Morgoth has his show named Morgoth's Review, which I had neglected to remember, mostly just because I mentally shortened him to Morgoth, and that's how I know him by. So we have Century branded. I had a few people tell me to call this the Turnip Farm or the Turnip Plantation or something like that. I thought that might be a little bit too silly, so I stuck with something that was a bit more professional. And this is now Turnip's Digest instead of Turnip's Review. Let's see. So this is important because last week we couldn't go live due to YouTube's very terrible policies about new channels and streaming. So this is the first live episode, and we will just go down the panel. Mr. Jay Burden, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me on. I'm excited to talk about it, and I'm honestly excited, at least personally, to learn from Mahler because I have a very limited area of expertise here.
Very good. Mr. Sandbatch, how are you this morning?
No, pretty good. I've spent the last, and I would point this out that today is the I don't know 100 and something anniversary of the day that some Yankee blew my great something grandfather's leg off in the peach orchard at Gettysburg. So for the last couple of days I've been preoccupied by the Battle of Gettysburg for some reason. But it's fun to talk about environmental law instead for a little bit, so I don't have to experience the transferred pain or something like that.
Yeah, a little bit of a genre dissonance, I guess. Yeah, I guess that's just a reminder. You and I should probably start covering U.S. history sometime soon.
Yeah.
Let's see, Mr. Mahler, how are you this morning?
I'm doing well.
Very good. Alrighty. So last week we covered a lot of direct text from the opinion because it was very, very important. It there were some parts of it that hinted as to where they might be looking towards or more favorable to ruling on next. There were a bunch of sort of giveaways about our Chief Justice being basically being dragged around by the conservative part of the court. The case today, West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency, not as much of a important opinion. Obviously, the consequences and the ruling is important, but we probably won't be spending as much time on the text today, mainly because it's we set a rather high bar last week going over a Roe v. Wade ruling. If something like that happens again, I'm sure we will delve right back into the opinion. But this morning, we are going to rely mainly on the talents and skills of Mr. Mahler to explain to us sort of what happened. And if any of you guys wanted to follow along, I'm sure that you could probably find West Virginia versus EPA and the text of the ruling on your own and comb through it. But we just need the overview for the purposes of this morning's show. So, Mr. Mahler, what's the significance of the ruling? Did anything stick out? Walk us through it, if you will.
The ruling is not as significant as some commentators thought it was going to be. Some people thought that the court was going to actually roll back deference to administrative agencies and their interpretations, or possibly even roll back the administrative state. That didn't happen. That was always fairly unlikely that would happen. That would be a seismic change in the legal landscape if you rolled back the administrative state, because effectively we have an administrative state as our government. So if you roll back the administrative state, you are effectively chopping off the government at the knees. So that would be a pretty extreme thing for the Supreme Court to do, and they just didn't do that here. They did however, put sort of a stop as to how far they're willing to go with deference to agency interpretations of at least congressional statutes, because there are two different kinds of deference you have to. There are three different levels, but there are two different kinds of deference that you have to know of up front. There's what's called Chevron deference, which is deference to an agency when it is interpreting the statute under which it has its authority, so something promulgated by Congress. And then there is our deference, which was originally Skidmore deference. You can call it either one, it's called both in literature. And our deference is when the agency is interpreting its own regulations. They're roughly the same for the two as to what exactly the Supreme Court and other courts will give in terms of deference. The terminology used is a little different. It doesn't really matter unless you're an attorney. They're effectively the same thing. They boil down to, if the interpretation by the agency is reasonable, then it's going to generally be upheld by the courts. So if it's unreasonable, they don't get to the court's going to actually come in and do a full review, as opposed to just giving deference to the agency. And so what happened here, the facts really aren't that interesting. It's more legally what happened, but the facts are very simple. It's the EPA is looking to regulate energy producers, so power plants, in such a way as to move us away from at least certain fossil fuels, coal in particular. Not surprising, West Virginia is the other party in this, given they're a major coal producer. So they're trying to move away from coal toward other sources. In this case, actually, they want to push toward natural gas because it is a lower polluting source. But ultimately, the goal, of course, is to push toward so-called renewables. Now, we can get into that. That's a policy issue. There's other things involved there. But the goal of the EPA was to create a regulatory regime that would push the entirety of the grid toward renewables and away from coal. And that's a change from how they used to regulate power plants, because it used to be they would look at individual power plants and what that power plant could do to reduce emissions. And that's a very different thing from saying you have to stop producing from your coal plant and produce from a natural gas plant, or even go so far as shut down a coal plant, build a new plant. It just depends on the size of the entity being regulated, because obviously there's going to be a huge difference between a small energy producer that has one plant or a large one that has, say, 100 plants. That one with 100 plants, if they have a mixture of different kinds of plants, they can kind of shift from one toward the other more easily. And so there'll be a different regulatory burden for the various entities here. But that's effectively the fact pattern in this case, and the court told the EPA they can't do that because they were making too big of a change, and they were going beyond what the statute authorized them to do.
All right, and just to the reason that we're covering this is that one of my friends pointed out that this could be an indicator that the court was willing to roll back the administrative state. You say that is not the case. If you could, elaborate, sort of tell our audience what it means. What is the administrative state now? Why were people sort of jumping onto this as if it would roll it back? And what's more likely to happen now? If you could elaborate on that, Mr. Mahler.
Of course. The administrative state, effectively, let's see, the best place to start with it would be we have what's called the non-delegation doctrine. Various parts of the government aren't permitted to delegate their powers to other parts of the government. As a general rule, it has some exceptions, and the administrative state is a really big exception. But for instance, Congress is not permitted to just tell the president, we're tired, we're going to go on vacation, you make all the laws. That would be a violation of the non-delegation doctrine. They're not permitted to do that. But the problem is the administrative state is almost precisely that. Because what the administrative state is, Congress creates statutorily an agency. That agency is actually an executive branch agency, typically anyway. They're almost all executive branch agencies. And so the executive branch agency now has the authority to make laws, because the EPA makes regulations, the FDA makes regulations, the DOJ all of these entities make regulations. And so they're making laws that are then enforced by the same branch because they're the executive branch and enforcing the laws is, of course, what they're supposed to be doing. And so there's an argument that the entirety of the administrative state is a violation of the non-delegation doctrine. There are many commentators who've made that argument. Some of the justices have seemed somewhat amenable to it in the past, maybe. But administrative law also is an area that creates kind of strange alliances on the court. It always has. The strangest one no longer exists because both parties are dead. But it was Scalia and Ginsburg. You would find them on the same side of issues in administrative law, where you wouldn't find them on the same side basically anywhere else. Because it's a difference in philosophy of how you run a government. It's not necessarily a straight up left versus right issue, or even a limited government versus more active government difference. Although obviously those who want a more active government are more likely to be on the side of preferring an administrative state, because if you have a permanent administrative state, it's easier to set up regulatory regimes and then actually administer them, because that's the whole point of the administrative state. And the reason that some people thought that possibly this case would roll that back is they were looking at it and thinking, maybe they'll roll back Chevron deference, or maybe they'll roll back our deference. Essentially just roll back the level of deference given to interpretations by administrative agencies. Now, there were some people who argued they may even go farther and say it's a violation of non-delegation, but that's always sort of pie in the sky. It's probably not going to happen. It could. I mean, theoretically, the court could do it. I don't know how Congress and the executive would react to that. They might just ignore it, which has happened to the Supreme Court before. You know, he's made his decision, let him enforce it. But we didn't see that here. We saw them basically say that, yes, we're going to uphold Chevron, our Skidmore, whatever, but you can't exceed them. You can't just decide you are going to create this entirely new regime. And particular, one of the reasons that they struck down what the EPA was attempting to do, but upheld deference at the same time. They looked at what Congress has done in the past, primarily the recent past, and Congress has struck down the very kind of regimes, or at least rejected them, decided not to follow through. And it's the exact same kind of regime the EPA enacted. And so the EPA was attempting to do what Congress has declined to do. And so that's a pretty good argument that Congress didn't give EPA the authority to do it. Because if Congress keeps saying, no, we won't do this, and then the EPA says, well, we're going to do it because you gave us the authority to do it, that's kind of inconsistent. So that's one of the reasons the court did not permit the EPA to do what they were attempting to do here.
Alrighty. And Mr. Sandbatch, for those that did not tune in last week, he is going to be our, I don't want to say authority because that's a terrifying power to give him, but he's going to be our great talent on American history. Do you have anything to add on the development of these deference doctrines, and any controversies in the United States history? That seems like something that you would be able to contribute in that regard, Mr. Sandbatch.
Well, in the deepest sense, this goes actually all the way back to it's either the necessary and proper clause or the proper and necessary clause. I cannot remember which way it goes. But it really, this is a kind of a foundation. This is why you really can't expect them to, roll this too far back, because, a lot of people will wonder, and this question applies really broadly. It touches all kinds of issues, like whether or not, public health agencies can mandate vaccines, or whether or not the EPA is allowed to force force billions and billions of dollars of spending to move the grid from, I think it was 38% to 28% coal fired in the net by the year 2030 or something like that. And that issue is whether or not Congress has the ability to delegate the ability to make laws down to some other organization. And that's the necessary and proper clause is what is the basis of that. And I don't know that anyone would really want to change that, which is why I think this is kind of a Cliff Notes version of what we've already seen, but. The really narrow ruling, the really narrow ruling here, I think, is that, it's whether or not the Congress has decided, whether or not Congress has in fact delegated the authority to the EPA that the EPA is claiming that they've had delegated to them. And in this case, we don't to grab, to go not nearly as far back into American history, similar to last week. And that's one of the reasons why this case is interesting, is because just like last week was sort of a vindication of a Scalia jurisprudential type, an example of the jurisprudence of Justice Scalia reaching from beyond the grave and managing to complete one of his major side quests in life. This is another one that actually builds heavily off of a 2015-2016 case, which I think was one of the last opinions that Scalia wrote before he died, which was West Virginia and the EPA. And really, the main thing that I think is going on here, there's two things that I think are going on here.
This one is Michigan v. EPA.
Yeah, that's it. In that ruling, and this is the precedent that's cited most, that everybody has been talking about, that sort of related to it. In that one, Scalia managed to kind of weasel his way around the necessary and proper clause by interpreting it to mean that anything that the EPA any study that the EPA commissioned, anything they hired a subcontractor to handle some bit of information about the mechanism of this shift from coal-fired plants to natural gas or whatever, whether or not the burden of cost on the specific entities that are going to have to make this shift, whether or not that was relevant. And the way he got out of the way he was able to sort of strike down something that would have been very expensive to coal-fired power producers, was to make the claim that because the EPA commissioned a study that included cost burdens to the producers, that it was something that the EPA would be forced to take into account. Now, in this ruling, the main thing that I see that's going on is that they've kind of closed a legal loophole that was opened by Scalia's gambit here, which was if you're going to force us to take into account the burden of costs, then one way that the EPA and really generally activists according to any issue, could be able to force some of the things that they wanted via lawfare. They could potentially commission a study that a legal challenge brought by a conservative group might have to rely on to get one aspect of their case considered, but in the process of doing so, some other aspect of that study might uphold. Here's an example. Okay, so if the EPA, if in order to strike down this incredible cost burden that might be shouldered by a coal-fired power plant, to make the transitions that are implied by the EPA regulations, that they would have to. The conservatives want to get around this by forcing them to take into account costs. But if you go shove something like the necessity of appointing dozens of LGBTQ plus enforcement officers into that cost burden study, then all of a sudden that's on the table again as well. Now that's an extreme example, but I think that's primarily the loophole that's being closed here.
Alrighty, Mr. Mahler, any comments on what Mr. Sandbatch has just said? Sorry.
Well, part of what was at issue here is what's called major questions, the major questions doctrine, and that was touched on because essentially the major questions doctrine requires that if an agency is called upon to regulate something that amounts to a major question, so an important sector of the economy, something like that, then there must be a clear statement from Congress that that was the intent of Congress. So to say it another way, Congress has to clearly state that they want the agency to have the authority to regulate this certain thing that Congress, of course, must originally have the authority to regulate. Otherwise, the agency cannot do that because that is a major question that is reserved to Congress.
Alrighty. So I think that mostly covers the sort of legal framework that we are working with, or the background and the decision that has actually been made. Does anyone have anything else that they want to add on the subject? Mr. Burden, I've kept you quiet, but I don't want to throw you into into something that you're not necessarily acquainted with. But any
No, that's all right. I mean, realistically, I'm not nearly as knowledgeable as either of the other two guests, so I'm just gonna kind of sit here until I have something to say.
Alrighty. Mr. Mahler, Mr. Sandbatch, if you two have anything else to add, speak now or we will move on. Alrighty. So that is the legal framework that we are working with. Now, I want to discuss what this could possibly mean for future rulings, future cases, sort of what the impact that this decision is going to have. Once again, we will be starting with Mr. Mahler. What are the implications in the future? Will this just stay with the EPA? Could this be used with other agencies? Are things going to be held in place? Will this get trampled over by a future court? Sort of walk us through what the implications might be here now that we've got the foundation to work with.
It's somewhat difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen with future courts because largely that depends on the composition of the court, and at this point that really depends on who dies. And of course who's in power to actually appoint a new justice. But we did just get a new justice, if we're going to very loosely use the term. So we'll see how the actual court, how its sort of stance on these issues develops in the future, because how the court decides things when it comes to administrative law tends to be very different from other areas of the law. There are some things that are just clearly political. They split left, right, and yes, there are people who say the court's not supposed to be political, but that's only insane people. Because of course the court is political, because everything is. And so administrative law is its own little area because it's how you view the appropriate way for the government to regulate society, the economy, and actually perform the duties of government. And so Scalia was much more favorable toward the administrative state, say, than Thomas. Thomas likes to either concur or make comments somewhere that he thinks it's time to review the entirety of the administrative state because he's more on the side of let's just get rid of it. Of course, if you just get rid of it, that is essentially a libertarian argument because there's no way you can regulate something as complicated as U.S., even just the economy, without the administrative state because you need these administrative agencies that have the expertise in-house to regulate their own specific niche areas. You're not going to have the expertise in Congress, for instance, to enact environmental regulations, since we're talking about the EPA. If Congress tries to do that, what would Congress have to do? They would have to call up experts. Well, what are they going to do? Are they going to have a pool of experts? If you have a pool of standing experts, you've just reconstituted the EPA, except it's a lot more work and a lot more cost. So you do have a very mixed bag here. If you oppose the administrative state, you are going to wind up creating the same sort of thing on the other end, just with greater cost and less expertise and probably more beholden to lobbyists. Although, yes, we could talk about regulatory capture. That's another issue. That's actually my area of expertise since that would be antitrust and specifically net neutrality. And there you have some real regulatory capture, just like textbook regulatory capture. But if you have that, you can't avoid the administrative state effectively if you're doing something as complicated, as complex, as broad as the U.S. economy and society, where you're enacting these regulations. So it's a matter of, are you going to have it up front and just part of your government, you declare this is what we're going to do, and then you have the agencies, or is it going to be sort of a shadow government? And so, but to get back to the court and what's going to happen with the court here, this does, of course, apply to other agencies. Now, other agencies will look at it and they will decide how they are going to act, at least the agencies that are actually run by people who are remotely competent, because they're going to look at it and say, okay, if we do X, Y, and Z, that's going to either not violate, or it's going to violate what the Supreme Court told us we can and cannot do. And so they will act accordingly. This is an incentive for them to do certain things and not to do certain things. Realistically, most of the agencies more or less stay within the authority Congress has delegated them. We could, of course, discuss whether or not Congress has delegated more authority than they should, or more authority than they even have, but most of the agencies don't necessarily go significantly outside those bounds. The EPA is always being sued because the EPA tends to go outside the bounds of the power it has been delegated, or the power it should even technically have under the authority from Congress and the Congress has under the Constitution. And so the EPA gets sued because the EPA is the one doing this sort of stuff. Generally speaking, the other agencies don't get sued as much because they're not doing this. They're not saying, well, we have the right to just shut down all the coal power plants. The EPA makes those kind of claims.
Right, and I will go to Mr. Sandbatch and then Mr. Burden to comment on what you've just said or the topic at hand. Mr. Sandbatch, do you have anything that you would like to add here?
Well, yeah, I mean, the EPA is a special political football. I don't like, for instance, I used the vaccine case whenever because I was in an argument about vaccines about a week ago, and it seemed vaguely relevant because, it's the necessary and proper clause that gives Congress the ability to do that. But the Congress is actually usually pretty good about explicitly delegating what they want these, like, for instance, the reason the vaccine case is probably not going to be rolled back anytime soon is because it's an instance where Congress very specifically delegated the ability to mandate vaccines under certain circumstances to you. I can't remember what the name of the authority is. The EPA is a specific political football because they do tend to make these very expansive claims, and I think it's because I haven't been really looking into this just too much. But whenever I was reading about this case, I was astonished at the breadth of the EPA's ability to interpret its own, its own ability to apply its, its specific its recommendations or its own internal laws. I do think one thing that's important to point out, and we may get into this a little bit later, that unfortunately for this idea that the EPA makes an expansive claim and then gets sued, and then the court has to pare back exactly what they're able to do. This has produced reams and reams of paperwork over the course of the last 60 years, but I think, unfortunately, probably both sides of the political spectrum eventually have to come to the conclusion that the EPA has been a somewhat successful organization. Like, we don't have situations any longer where the Chicago River catches fire 7 times in over a decade. We have in one of the things that bothers me about lefty environmentalists is they frequently tend to take the view that the United States is environmentally still in the same situation it was in the 1960s, and we're drastically improved from that. So actually, unfortunately, our body of environmental law has been relatively successful in cleaning up the environment. But one of the other things I think is interesting here is one of the very expansive claims that the EPA is making here is that, and everybody knows I'm kind of a spreadsheet nationalist guy, and they're essentially making the claim that based on a data model that says we need to move from 38 to 27% coal-fired power plants sometime in the next 30 years, that we can impose sweeping changes on the way the entire country goes about getting its power. It's really interesting that the court has decided that they can't do that because generally I think the court's pretty friendly to data modeling and that sort of thing. So that this is another kind of interesting aspect to this case because the court has decided exactly where the limit of that your ability to just plug some numbers into a spreadsheet and make an arbitrary declaration is. And so I think that's why the EPA is more interesting than other regulatory bodies this way, and also why I think this ruling could be interesting for the way specifically the government agencies go about data modeling. This may force them to be a little bit more specific with the way they go about making recommendations.
Alrighty, and Mr. Burden, do you have anything to add on the subject or the comments of the two individuals before you?
Yeah, I do. So I have first first a comment, then a question, right? So I would say like one of the reasons I kind of ended up on this side was a lot of like Second Amendment activism stuff. Obviously, being from Virginia, that was very much on the table a few years ago. But I'm curious how this will affect the ATF specifically, because and maybe it's just my personal bias, but if I think of kind of egregious administrative agencies that regularly make sweeping laws, the ATF is kind of up at the top of that. And so specifically what I'm curious about is that there have been kind of teases for a while that the ATF is essentially going to regulate certain, commonly used firearms as essentially NFA items. And so I'm wondering, going off of that test you mentioned of kind of, uh, what the Congress has signaled, I wonder if that will change things like that, where we kind of have to go back to, well, what was the most recent, or would we have to go back to, well, what was the most recent, I guess, like congressional decision? Does that seem likely? Again, I don't really know what to expect from that.
Mr. Mahler, I suppose we'll have you answer that question first, being as you are the attorney on the panel.
Well, the ATF obviously is an extremely political organization. As was mentioned, so is the EPA, and that's part of the reason you get the sort of regulations you get out of the EPA, because the EPA, depending on which administration you have, if you have a Democrat administration that's favorable toward environmental regulation, the EPA will be more aggressive. If you have a Republican administration, they'll be less aggressive unless they just want to annoy the Republican administration, then they'll be more aggressive, so they have to sue them. But the same thing happens with the ATF. The ATF is, of course, extremely political. And so it's going to depend on who's in power politically as to what the ATF is doing, more so even than the authority delegated to the ATF and what the ATF is actually tasked with doing. It's just going to be politics. It is a very political organization. So does the decision here apply to the ATF? Yes. Is it going to really change what the ATF does? Probably not. The ATF has a pretty broad grant of authority.
Alrighty, Mr. Sandbatch, would you have anything? And then we will go back to Mr. Burden.
No, I don't think I have anything to add. But I would just say the same thing that we just heard.
Alrighty. All right,
So,
Mr. Burden.
so I have a question, Mahler. I know that you said that you don't consider this to be kind of a shot across the bow of the administrative state, but will it affect the ability of these administrative agencies to be used as kind of political cudgels? Because that's really what I'm kind of curious to see going forward.
Mr. Mahler.
The agencies will definitely still be used as political cudgels. It depends on the agencies. Different agencies are organized in different ways and are more or less political. Typically, more or less political, directly correlated with how the top tier staff are assigned to the agency. If you have the same staff year after year or even decade after decade, then you're going to have a culture that develops within that organization and it's relatively insulated from the political process. But if the person at the top is assigned by the president, that's going to be more explicitly political because that person is going to come in, and if he's competent, he's going to clean house, which is what you usually do with U.S. attorneys and things like that when you take power. Now, of course, you have the media will scream bloody murder about it, but just look at how many U.S. attorneys Clinton fired. That's just how the game is played. And so different agencies will have different levels of political involvement depending on their structure. They will probably still be just as political as they were before the decision, because this doesn't really change how they can operate. It changes how they'll have to play the game a little bit, but a minor rule change like this, and it's even not really a rule change, it's just enforcing the actual existing rule. I don't think it's going to change agency behavior in any appreciable way.
Alrighty, Mr. Sandbatch, do you have anything you would like to add?
On that one, I think he's right. I don't think, and good lord, if we may be veering straight into his legal specialty here. But one of the things that fascinated me about this, again, outside of the data, because data modeling is like it's a sort of spurgtism of mine. One of the things that I thought was fascinating is that this is especially because of the cost burden analysis and the question of whether or not it's specifically within the scope of the EPA to mandate this kind of extraordinarily expensive conversion, is whether or not one of the things the EPA is kind of famous for is being and I don't know exactly what the reasons for this are, but it just so happens that if this opinion had not appeared and had the EPA been allowed to proceed, they would have been able to impose billions and billions of dollars of costs on essentially these red state producers. Now, in order to make the transitions that would have been necessary, you don't hire the government to do that. You don't hire the EPA to come in and refurbish your factory to comply with EPA standards. You have to go, offer, you have to put contracts up for bid, and it's generally going to be private. It's in like 99.9% of cases, it's going to be private actors who make these bids, who take these bids, and who end up doing who end up doing these conversions. This is one of the most political things the EPA is able to do this way, and I always talk about this because government contracting and regulatory compliance is a business that it's a business that is almost entirely leftist. So one of the things that this does, and it doesn't really affect the administrative state so much, but whenever Burden and I were talking about this the other day, when you think of progressivism as a kind of perfect marriage of private and public sphere entities, it's how it's conceived. And one of the things this does sort of do, that it is political and is a kind of aggressive move on the part of the court, is to tell the EPA, no, you essentially can't go take these probably conservative business owners and force them to offload millions or billions of dollars in business to regulatory compliance consultants and new green energy startups and the entire ESG ecosystem that's forming. No, the EPA is not allowed to force that kind of wealth transfer without a much better argument for doing so than because our spreadsheet model says you need to. And so that's one of the ways that I think this is a kind of aggressive political ruling that maybe doesn't necessarily just affect the behavior of the EPA. It does affect the EPA's ability to basically kick contracts out to leftist businesses. I think that's a place that might be worth exploring.
Alrighty, Mr. Mahler, we'll let you comment on that, and then we will backtrack ever so slightly to a topic that I want to explore further, and when we get there, I will open up the floor and stop being so interventionist. But first, Mr. Mahler, your comments.
I think fundamentally the core problem we have on the right when it comes to this particular issue, particularly environmentalism, although it's related to another of other regulatory issues, is that we've just ceded the field. We've let the left take over an issue that was traditionally a conservative issue, traditionally a traditionalist issue. Let's not forget that Richard Nixon is effectively the one who started the EPA. Yes, he just brought together a bunch of other agencies that existed at the time and made it organized, but he clearly had a plan and a vision for how this could be done, and Republicans, conservatives completely dropped the ball and let the left just colonize the EPA and take it over. But specifically when it comes to the issue of compliance with environmental regulations and the like, there's no reason that the left should own these businesses, this sector of the economy. The right should be pushing for a number of things, particularly nuclear energy, since that's something we can do today. There are only a handful of endgame solutions when it comes to energy, and nuclear is one of those. So we should push for nuclear. We really shouldn't still be using as much coal as we are. There's no reason. It's not particularly efficient. It's very intensive. It's extremely environmentally destructive to harvest the coal, to mine the coal. So yes, obviously you have infrastructure in certain states. Again, that's why West Virginia is involved in this case. But there's no reason those states can't transition to other things. You are supposed to use the money you are making from if you have an entity, a business, a sector of your economy that you know is going to last for a limited period of time, and you know that when it comes to fossil fuels, it's going to last for a limited period of time. We could argue about how long, but at any rate, regardless, it's limited. You use the money you are generating from that enterprise, from that sector of the economy. Part of it should go toward what comes after that, what you're doing next. You don't just put all of your eggs in this basket and go, we will use coal forever. That is our entire economy, and we will just collapse into a pile of dust when people stop using coal. That's a really bad plan. And yet, on the right, that's sort of what we've been doing. We just entrench on whatever it is we're doing and say we are not going to change or do anything different, and we will absolutely categorically refuse to look to the future. And that's just dumb. We should be investing in. I'm not saying we have to use the so called green energy. Nuclear actually is the most green energy, so if we want to use that branding, by all means. But I don't particularly like wind energy. I don't think solar could be a solution. It's just not there yet. But we should be heavily investing in these issues. We should take these issues for our side, not just let the left have these issues and run with them. And one quick comment on the ATF before we move on to the next thing. It's worth noting that the ATF originally was basically just revenue generation. So that's part of the reason that they behave the way they do, because entities that start off just as a taxman for the government behave in a certain fashion. Now they become more than that, but again, and the reason I want to comment on this is because it's the same issue. We let the left colonize the ATF and take it away from what it was supposed to be. Granted, part of what it was supposed to be originally was prohibition enforcement, which was not good, but we let the left take it over and use it as a political cudgel, because the right's just bad at the game a lot of the time.
Alrighty. I am certain we will come back to revisit a lot of these topics later in the show, but for now, I want to bring up a more open-ended discussion of which I will not be sort of guiding. I will just throw the question out there, open the floor, and then whoever speaks is going to be whoever speaks. So we heard in Mahler's comments a few minutes earlier that this is primarily or not primarily a question, but this has implications of do you want a very direct and open, formal administrative state, or do you just want a shadow government? What I would like the panel to discuss, if there indeed are any opinions on this topic, which do we prefer? What would be the more right-wing position? Does the right wing even have a position on this? What would be the best position, regardless of political affiliation? Explore those lines of reasoning, because I think we can get a lot of good discussion out of this. We'll start with whoever speaks up first.
All right. So to me, and maybe this is just the mold bug influence, but I very much do have a preference for formalism, right? In the sense that, kind of the government makes promises and keeps them, kind of regardless of how I personally feel about them. And it's kind of a more classical version of tyranny, right? Which is essentially tyranny is when the Lord breaks his own promise, breaks his oath. Like tyranny isn't when he comes around, asking for his levy. Tyranny is when he shows up 2 weeks early and takes all your sheep. So that's an overly simplistic way of looking at it. But at least from my perspective, I do think that the more like hierarchical take, kind of completely absent of, any specific issue, is that preference for formalism. Now that said, I think we're currently in a position where a win is a win, and so if we can kind of, I guess, if we can advance our cause, by kind of breaking those, I'm not afraid to take that. Maybe not forever, but at least for now. And I realize that's not the most consistent position, but when you're 150 pounds, and fighting Mike Tyson, you kind of take what you can get.
So feel free to jump in. I'm trying to let this be a little bit more open-ended.
Well, I'm of course going to, as I'm sure no one's surprised, going to come down on the side of yes, I support having an administrative state, a bureaucracy, a permanent government. I'm not a fan of democracy, so it's not too surprising that I would want something more permanent. But when it comes to the administrative state, it makes perfect sense to have these entities that have this core expertise that is maintained over generations in some cases, and they just focus on this particular area. Expertise is important. We hate experts, to just be blunt. In the US, there's sort of a cult of ignorance. Anyone who sets himself up as an expert is viewed as being arrogant, and people dislike him. And that's a problem. And even on the right, we have a little bit of that still clings to people. It may be libertarian priors or any number of things, Enlightenment priors, you're taking the Declaration too seriously, whatever it happens to be. And so the natural, the conservative, the traditionalist position is that hierarchy is part of reality. There are people who know more, there are people who know less, and that applies to various different subjects. Someone may be an expert in X, Y, and Z, another person is an expert in A. You want people performing the duties for which they are best suited. And so you have administrative agencies that are suited to the task they are performing. And so if you need to regulate, say, the internet, in our case, unfortunately, that's split between a number of different agencies. You have the FCC, you have the FTC, and you have the DOJ that all do different things. Our system's not exactly as organized as it could be, but it is better than having nothing. And so you have the agencies that are regulating these areas, and the goal is consistency. And that's one of the most important things. Any business owner will tell you predictability is one of the most important things they want from any regulatory or other government agency with which they have to work. Because you don't want someone new to come in and just completely change everything, because that is what is very expensive for your business. Compliance can be expensive. Complying with rules that change every 4 years is astronomically expensive. And so you want that consistency. You want the predictability. You want a structure that does not change.
So I completely agree with you. And one of the areas you see that most in is actually in banking, right? So I have a finance degree, and in kind of looking for a job, I've been going to a lot of local banks, right? And knowing people that work in local banks, what you realize is that essentially a lot of the regulation post 2008 was essentially a massive transfer of power from small banks to large banks. And the method for that was essentially compliance. So now roughly half the staff of a small bank works in compliance and essentially works in making sure that they are in accordance with kind of the diktats of the administrative state. And these are regulations that change incredibly often. And if you're found outside of them, it just shuts down these smaller organizations, places like Wells Fargo, like BlackRock. And obviously, I'm speaking very broadly about the administrative state here, but they can essentially tank the hit, right? For them, they're big enough that they have lawyers, they can pay it off. But if you're, the first farmers bank of, the middle of nowhere, Anytown, USA, right? One hit and you're done. And not only that, but your profit margins, which weren't great to begin with, are already being kind of sapped by the need to comply, and it gets worse because it's not a one and done solution, right? It's not like, okay, we hired some guy, he told us how to set up our accounts, and now we are in compliance forever. These regulations are constantly changing, and I think that's the reason that we've seen, the emergence of woke capital, to use kind of an overplayed term, but essentially, like, as these methods enable the centralization of power within an industry, right? Because as there's more and more compliance and more kind of barriers to entry, it kind of behooves everyone involved to be as big as possible.
Well, I think I kind of blew my wad on whether or not on how I feel about the administrative state. Whenever I said that generally the EPA has been successful in the last 80 years or so, but you referred to 2000 to stuff that sort of happened since 2008, and grab a couple of these points. But I'm going to start in a really weird place and use again an environmental example, which is an example of how the administrative state's actually been not terrible, but the way it operates is it tends to make a statement and then have to modify its statement. And so, back in the 1940s, you all know what an alligator gar is, like the fish. It's in like big ugly fish that lives in southern rivers. Okay, well, in the 1940s, the relevant federal regulatory bodies decided this was an undesirable fish to have in your ecosystems, and they actually mandated that any alligator gar that's caught alive has to be killed before it's killed and thrown back, or killed and disposed of. And this created a situation that's called a trophic cascade. So like the alligator gars that eat the largemouth bass disappeared, the largemouth bass proliferated, ate all of the smaller fish, ate all of the larger versions of the smaller fish. The smaller versions of the smaller fish had a population bloom. They ate all the algae, and it eroded the Trinity River away. The EPA, from a libertarian perspective, this is an argument against having any kind of regulatory bodies, but they have since corrected themselves in a lot of ways, and I think it's sort of difficult to make an argument against, contra the idea that, especially in environmental law, and environmental regulation, that we have not gotten exponentially better. There are more trees in the United States now than there ever have been before. This is in large part due to the EPA setting regulations to say, no, you can't just clear cut the entire state of Alabama for the third time in 2 centuries. We're going to have to pay more attention to the way we go about doing this. But there is something that has happened in the last really 10 or 15 years, and I mean, because you're referring specifically to like sort of banking regulations that were imposed after the 2008 crisis, and this is I was thinking about this the other day, because like Turnip Seed, you're younger, Burden, you're younger. You all probably don't have much of a memory of the government prior to Obama's administration. This is actually it's actually an incredible paradigm shift that has occurred in the last 15 years or so, where organizations like the EPA have been turned loose as like political mercenaries to do battle on their enemies. I mean, that's a relatively new thing that I would like to see go away. And so my position on the administrative state is actually generally positive, but the way it's looked for the last 10 or 15 years, I mean, something's got to be done about that.
So, you made a reference to my youth. 2008. I was born in 2003. That would have made me about 5 years old at the time of that occurrence, which would be the election, the crisis, all this other stuff. Now, I'm not going to jump in with moderation here. Actually, I'm just going to throw a question out there. Mr. Sandbatch, I don't think it would be unfair to say that you tend to have a much more favorable view towards the progressive movement that saw great ascendancy in the United States between about 1890 and 1920, give or take. You can throw, I'm sure, much more precise years on those eras there. They, if I understand correctly, tended to be much more in favor of a sort of very clean and efficient bureaucratic system and a much cleaner set of regulations for the United States that sort of, and I believe the justification was to rationalize sets of outdated and archaic laws that might not have been as efficient, that might have caused more harm than good. How much would that progressive movement vision of the administrative state differ from what we see today, just to make sure that we get the clear picture?
Well, this is a political problem, I think, because I don't think progressivism has changed, at least in the scope of what it likes to do. I don't think it's changed all that much. Again, these ideas that I was talking about, so like state compliance, public contract bidding, or even really just politically, even just one side of the political spectrum being, and here's an example that I like to use, for better or worse, aquacultural systems are coming, aquaponic systems are coming, and there are companies out in California that have sprung on this idea. And right now in the state of South Carolina, just granted $435 million contract to a company in California that's going to come in and build this giant aquaponic farming system. And I, I don't have a problem with this. I think this is mostly a good thing. But the biggest issue that I see is that conservatives, the right specifically, has kind of abandoned in the last 30 or 40 years, they've abandoned this kind of this kind of political concept that, well, we should also be aggressively pushing ourselves into this, into this arena for public contracts, and this where we can get state subsidies to do things that are going to be especially, good for the environment, or good for the public welfare, or something like that. I don't really have a problem with the scheme still, so much as I do with the fact that, for whatever reason, the right wing has fallen badly behind in our ability to take advantage of the opportunities that are offered by a system that kicks contracts out like this. And it's Mr. Mahler was saying this earlier. It's like this is an instance where the right has sort of ceded the field. So I don't necessarily think it's a problem with progressivism as it's defined on paper, as this kind of perfect merit, this kind of union or cooperation between the public and private spheres. What I see is that, like, it's kind of like a washing machine. When your washing machine gets something real heavy in it, or the load gets unbalanced and the machine starts shaking back and forth. That's kind of what's happened, because really since the 1970s, the right wing has almost entirely abandoned this idea that we can use advocacy and use public, the public coffers, the public dime, to subsidize our own vision for what a green future looks like, or what our own vision for what any kind of future looks like. So I mean, that's kind of my take on it. I don't know. That was kind of a prevaricating answer, though.
So I might, and this is something I don't want to get too like bogged down into this disagreement, but I kind of think that part of the reason that the right has kind of pushed away from that, I think, has to do with the fact that I think that centralization and kind of the administrative state doesn't naturally lend itself to the kind of politics we support. I think that it can essentially end up being a sort of essentially like patronage network. And I think that the kind of people who latch themselves onto that patronage network are not our friends. And so I think that it is kind of, in a way, an entropic force. And I don't mean to defend the right since the 70s. I think they're largely completely incompetent. But I think that maybe at least part of what they're sensing, because is that kind of press, or like anti-right force, whatever you want to call it. And I would also disagree, because there are some areas which the right has been fairly good at collecting subsidies, right? So like a lot of defense subsidies in particular, like a lot of those countries are like places near where I went to school, like Radford, Virginia, which has, a missile factory, and places like that where I think that they have been slightly more successful. But I do think that kind of force for government subsidies, those always kind of come with strings attached, and the people handing out that kind of money don't really have our values in mind, and so that it's kind of a like a hidden, kind of like a hidden poison pill, if that makes sense.
This is true, and you're right to point out the defense industry as a case that, where the right has been very good. But again, this is kind of my broken washing machine model again. I think you're absolutely right that the kind of people who are involved in these processes aren't necessarily our friends anymore. But I would point out that if you go back to the 1950s, especially if you go back to the 1920s, you'll find a much more even balance, and that seeding the field it's this kind of an activation energy style question, or achieving critical mass. It is much more difficult to go from 0% to 10% of any sort of system than it is to go from 10% to 50, or from 50 to 60, or something like that. Okay, so I do agree that it would be especially difficult that it is especially difficult right now for sort of right wingers to decide they want to start an aquaponic shrimp farm in like Upper South Carolina or something like that. I know it's a very specific example, but it's one that I've actually been looking at recently, and it would be very difficult for say somebody that wants to start an aquaponic shrimp farm in Spartanburg, South Carolina, to be able to get past the incredibly high startup costs of this kind of operation, unless they take monies from some sort of ESG bank, which is in cahoots with the EPA, and says that you have to hire 2 lesbians and one Indian or something like that, and just like, well, I only have enough money here to hire like my 3 best friends, and so you don't get the money. I'm not quite sure how to solve this problem, but I think it has to be solved.
Alrighty. Mr. Mahler, if you are still with us, I see you toggling a little bit with sound and headphones and all of that. Still there?
I'm still here. My Bluetooth headphones decided to disconnect for some reason. I can still hear, but I'm listening through the monitor instead of the headphones.
Alrighty. I was going to say what I'm going to do here is I will give the last word to Mr. Mahler. I'll let him comment on what everyone's just said, if he in fact heard it, ask him a question, and then we'll go back to the more structured style, and then we will open the floor at the very end of this discussion here. So, Mr. Mahler, I will ask you the question, just give you sort of free reign until you exhaust what you have to say. My audience might be just a little bit hesitant of embracing anything that has the word administrative in front of it, because that has become very tainted with what we see in the modern day today. The past 20 years hasn't necessarily lent itself well to people being generally supportive of bureaucracy administration. So I just wanted to ask you, since you also are favorable of presumably the formal administrative state, what does the ideal look like? How does it differ from what we see today? Does it have the same problems that we have? You might want to elaborate there. I figured I would give you the chance, and also give you the chance to comment on what Mr. Bird and Mr. Sandbatch have been saying.
I think part of the problem and part of the reason the right currently opposes the administrative state is because of what it has become, which was commented on. And the reason it's become that is because more or less we're in sort of the late stages, both of capitalism and democracy. And in the former case, we're kind of in a looting stage, which is unfortunate, but it is partly the reality of it. And when it comes to the more explicitly political, the democratic side of things, the Democrats, to use the same term but in a different sense, recognize that we are in that late stage, and so they are pursuing not necessarily a more realpolitik, but just a more mercenary view of things. Their entire goal is power, and democracy sort of does incentivize that, because does it matter what you do if you're not in power? No, not really. Power is what matters most. And so they have realized that even if they can't necessarily win at the ballot box yet, they're working on that, they'll be there soon, they can still win if they can get their people into key positions and use those positions in order to push for what they want in any way possible. And they have been pretty good about doing that through the administrative state, through the courts, various ways like that. The right has not been playing the game. There are some historical reasons for that. There are philosophical reasons for that. The right still has somewhat of a libertarian strain, which restrains people from actually acting rationally, because libertarians will stand back and watch everything burn, which does not work very well in the long run. So if your opponents are actually playing the game to win and you're just spectating, well, they're going to win. And so the right has this libertarian strain that we need to do away with that strain. It does not help us. It harms us. It has harmed us for a long time. It is explicitly designed to harm people on the right because it appeals to certain segments of the right, and then it causes them not to act rationally, not to act in their own self-interest, not to act in the interests of their fellows. And so that leaves the field open for the left to pursue whatever it is they want to pursue. And they've been doing that for decades. It's been very effective for them. We have to realize that we are playing the game to win. And to play the game to win, you don't come to the table with these preconceived notions when it comes to economics or what you can and cannot do with the government. You can implement some of those things once you're in a position of power, if they make sense then. You can't implement them now when you are not in a position of power and when you are letting your power, what remains of it, be further eroded by holding to these supposed ideals that do not serve. They are tools that are not fit for purpose, and so we need to adopt a more rational approach to things. I'm not saying we have to do away with the administrative state. Capture it as much as you can. Have your own people in positions of power. And part of how you can do that is just not having these positions that don't make any sense. To bring up my specific area of expertise, if you're talking about, say, net neutrality, the right opposed net neutrality. Granted, it was largely boomers and a small sliver of others who are libertarian and bent. But the right opposed it, which was absolutely insane, because it actually would have benefited the right more than the left. And the right was made to oppose it largely because of talk radio hosts who went after it, of these sort of faulty economic arguments. And also, okay, let's say it burdens ISPs. Can you name a single ISP that's actually particularly conservative? Do you care if any of them wind up paying a little more in costs? They're not going to pass on all of it. They'll pass on some of it, of course, but it'll be a hit to their bottom line. But it would have been a foundation on which to build to further protect interests of the right that have been eroded since then. And so we have to act rationally. We have to approach these issues in a way that makes sense for our side, instead of saying, well, we can't do X, Y, and Z, and then proceeding from there. Because what happens when you tell your opponent, I won't do X, Y, and Z? Well, your opponent is going to do exactly what would require you to do X, Y, and Z, knowing you won't respond. You've just handed your opponent the win. And so, essentially, it boils down to the right has to actually learn to play the game and do so.
Alrighty, and we will revisit these topics, I'm sure, and more, I would also presume, when we open up the floor later in the show. But now I would like to return back to the more structured and formal style that we left off at. Remember, we are talking about a Supreme Court decision, though I am very glad we have discussed a lot of the implications, because that's mostly why I wanted to do this episode. Entirely focused on the implications, basically. So, what I would like to discuss now is the last thing I believe we left off at was, what future implications could this decision have? And we veered off a little bit from there. Now, I would like to talk about what this means at the very basic level, because I'm sure a lot of people aren't, ignorant of the fact that a lot of environmental regulations and a lot of other maliciously motivated regulations that have been passed and enforced in the last couple of years have been just harming normal people. A lot of people blame those regulations on the sharp increase of gasoline prices. It's a very common thing to see online and hear in person, that the current administration shutting down oil production on large and massive scales and future oil production has caused gasoline prices to spike. And I'm sure that we could come up with a few other examples also dealing with the environment. So I would like to shift the focus now more towards a very, very strict practicality. Will this decision have any potential effects on what average people might see? Is the EPA is it likely that the EPA will tone it down now? Are other regulations going to be less strictly enforced? Does it even impact them? Things along those lines. We will start once again with our attorney, Mr. Mahler, and then we will pass it on to our other two guests. Mr. Mahler.
Well, the good news is my headphones are now working again, since apparently Bluetooth just decided to be quirky for a moment there. But when it comes to the practical consequences of the decision and what people will see, at the pump or at your electrical bill, what have you, there may be some consequences in the short term, but there will definitely be consequences in the long term, depending on how the EPA ultimately responds to the decision and how Congress responds, because Congress is also extremely relevant here, because Congress, of course, could come back and just delegate the authority to the EPA claimed to have, and the court said, no, you don't. So if Congress does that, then the EPA can just bring it right back. That's, to go back to net neutrality again, that's actually similar to what happened with net neutrality. There are, under the relevant statutory regime, there are two different ways that telecommunications entity can be regulated, and one is significantly, without getting into too many details, one is significantly more invasive and permits much more thorough regulation. The first version of net neutrality in the US was enacted under the light touch, so-called regulation. The ISPs, for some insane reason, decided to object to that. The regulatory agencies had said, we're going to take a light touch approach. We're going to regulate you in a very small way. We're just attempting to achieve this particular goal in the least invasive way we can. And the ISPs sued and won, because what the FTC in this case was attempting to do, it was not permitted to do under that particular title. Well, the problem with that is that the ISPs were getting completely insane, because the FTC just came back and said, okay, fine, and regulated them under the other article, which permits extremely invasive regulation. And so all they did was get much more invasive regulation imposed on themselves. So they won possibly the worst legal victory in history when it comes to administrative law. So thank you, Verizon, you bunch of geniuses. Of course, they came back and managed to get rid of it by sticking their former attorney/lobbyist into the FTC. So there's your regulatory capture. That's how that works. And that's why net neutrality was ultimately repealed, was because of corruption on the part of Verizon and other ISPs. I assume Verizon drew the short stick, and so they were the ones who had to bring the lawsuit. That's probably how that happened, in a back room somewhere. But in the case of this particular instant matter with the EPA, yes, it means that we will be able to continue producing power from coal at the rate we currently are. I don't know what exactly the current numbers are. The goal was to reduce it from, what was it, 37 to 27% or something like that, 38 to 27%. So I don't know what we're at right now. But it means the EPA cannot regulate the entirety of the energy market and attempt to shift the mixture in that way. But just because you can't regulate a particular mixture of energy generation in this way doesn't mean you can't do it at all. If I can't tell you to do X, Y, and Z, but I can incentivize you to do X, Y, and Z, I achieve the same end goal. And that is, for instance, to use an example that is often cited, that's how the government enforces speed limits and drinking age laws. Highway funds go from the state to the federal level, from the federal level back to the states, with ties attached to them. And so the ties are, don't set your speed limit higher than X, keep your drinking age at 21. And so that's how the government enforces things, gets the states to do something that the government cannot tell the states to do. And so the EPA will just probably find some other way to achieve the goal. I don't know what exactly they'll use yet, but there are various ways they could do it. One way, of course, that they will definitely use is that they are still permitted to regulate individual plants. Well, if you want to disincentivize the use of coal and incentivize, incidentally, natural gas, so they're not saying no fossil fuels, they're just saying please use the one that is less polluting. It's very easy. You don't regulate the natural gases heavily, you regulate coal more heavily. You disincentivize the use of coal, you incentivize natural gas, and you incentivize renewables with, investment or whatever it happens to be, grants, contractual benefits, certain treatment, tax treatment. There are all sorts of ways you can do this. So the EPA will come back and try the same thing, because their goals haven't changed. They're looking at this saying, we want to achieve this end goal. The court has simply told them they can't use this particular means to achieve the goal. Well, they'll find another means. They'll find other various means that are within their power to achieve that goal. So ultimately, will this change anything? Probably not. It will change in the short term what the EPA is permitted to do. It will probably allow coal to continue producing at a high level for a certain time, but the end goal hasn't changed. Maybe the year in which it will be reached has been put off by, you know, 5 to 10 years or what have you. But ultimately, I still don't think this case particularly changes much. And I don't take it as a signal from the court, particularly given the composition of the court now, that they're going to revisit the administrative state in any significant way.
Alrighty, Mr. Burden, you've hinted that you have practical experience dealing with the EPA. Perhaps you have something to comment on with this question, or Mr. Mahler's comments.
So I do kind of want to go back to your original question about how will this affect energy prices, right? So interestingly enough, if you look at actually the core cause of why energy prices are as high as they are, a large part of that is government action, right? Like you can't get around that. So I'm not going to deny that. But a lot of it is kind of the second order effects of government action. So drilling and searching out new deposits is extraordinarily expensive, right? And it also takes a while for it to pay off, right? Like you can't just send an oil derrick out into your backyard and bam, have 10,000 extra gallons of oil, right? It takes a long time. So you see this generally that like you said earlier, Mahler, that essentially businesses are incredibly risk averse, right? And so they will react to even the perceived hint of future legislation. So what the Biden administration has been hinting at is that there will be major, quote unquote, energy reforms coming at the end of this year. They've also said that they want to have greenhouse gas emissions by, I think, the end of the decade, and have a net neutral energy grid by 2035, I believe. My numbers might be slightly off on that. But my point is, I think that the problem is that energy producers are looking around and saying, there's no way in hell I'm going to put up billions of dollars for something that's, might be legislated out of existence in 5 years. And so I think that while this is to a certain degree a win, I think that it's probably not going to affect things all that much, just because I think that there's very little incentive right now to really, I guess, increase fossil fuel production, other than obviously natural gas, which has been kind of carved out. But that's at least my take on it.
Alrighty.
A key point, just a quick comment
Yeah.
on one point there. And this is something that we've sort of touched on tangentially but haven't mentioned explicitly. One of the most important functions of a regulatory agency or government, whatever it happens to be, some agency that sits above the players in the market and tells them what they can and cannot do or what they must do in this particular case, is that it solves the concerted action problem. If you just have market players competing with each other, they are never going to do something that is individually expensive and that puts them at a disadvantage. So if you are currently producing energy in a certain way and you want to reach another level of production that is costly to achieve, you are not going to get there simply with market players, because market players are going to look at it and go, that's not rational. If I invest, I get outcompeted here, and then I am forced to exit the market. Now, if you have a regulatory agent say you have to do this, then all of the players have to do it at once, and you solve that concerted action problem, because they're not looking at each other going, well, I'm not moving first, because if I move first, I lose. And so that's what you have when it comes to switching the mixture of fuels, the sources from which you produce energy. And that's one of the major benefits of having a regulatory agency.
Alrighty, Mr. Sandbatch, you've been quiet so far on this issue. Do you have any comments?
Well, yeah, I mean, on the specific issue of why gas is so expensive right now, there's not a whole lot of relevance here. Now, what Burden said, that may be true. The Biden administration may be planning some sort of regulation, but if you notice over the course of the last 6 months or so, especially when Jan Psaki was the talking head that fronted White House policy, she would say over and over again, there are 9,000 pre-approved drilling permits. 9,000 pre-approved drilling permits. This isn't our problem. This is a This is a problem with oil corporations. They don't want to, they're hesitant to expand their production, which is causing prices to, drive up. Of course, we know there are exogenous reasons why the price of gas is exorbitantly high as it is today. But we also know there are things occurring in the United States that are preventing that price from coming down. And one of them is old Larry Fink and his a little over $235 billion in voting, vote shares that he can exert on oil and gas companies. And he said, and he's kind of he's kind of walked this comment back, but at the height of this gas scare, what he said was, well, our shareholders and we've come together and we've decided that if oil companies choose to take action that is going to, in our opinion, negatively impact the environment, that we're going to use our voting shares to make life hell for them. Okay, and so this is exactly the problem with not having a vested regulatory agency in a lot of ways, is because what we've just done here is we've kicked this out to a shadow EPA that is really operating in concert with the political schemes of the regime, but without really any accountability, and from a position that, a sort of classic 1980s right-wing doctrine can't handle. And what does this mean for the specific future of oil, of energy prices beyond that? I do think there is a little bit of a shot. Like I said, there's a little bit of a shot across the bow in that the EPA is not allowing the court is not allowing what is currently an entirely captured leftist industry sector to profit on the inevitable demise of coal-fired power production. I think this is a really big win if you happen to be currently in the business of producing energy from coal, or from extracting coal from the ground. But I think everyone can see the writing on the wall. The EPA is going to find a way to get around this, and maybe they should. I'm not sure there's a good strong argument for continuing to ramp up coal, like energy from coal production. But I think it's mostly gone, and the devil's in the details here. So maybe the standard of evidence has increased for why the EPA needs to do something, like just because the spreadsheet with 3 inputs says we need to lower the total production by 10%. There's quite a bit of clarification, I think, for the way this is going forward, but the writing is absolutely, I think, on the wall that natural gas is the preferred mechanism of energy generation. Coal is on its way out. It just got an experimental treatment that's going to extend its life for 6 months. Is what happened here.
Alrighty, we'll let Mr. Mahler comment, and then we will finish off this subject with Mr. Burden if he has anything to add after Mr. Mahler. So, Mr. Mahler.
Well, there is one related issue that we haven't mentioned explicitly when it comes to the price of fuel and so much else in our economy, and that's speculation. So much of what we pay for various items, and that goes from foodstuffs to fuel to basically almost everything in our economy, the price is driven by speculation. It's driven by speculators on the market who are gambling on the future cost of the particular commodity in question. And so you'll have speculators that will say, well, I think that in 3 years, the cost of coal will be X. And then there are ways that you can effectively invest in that guess, that gamble. And so you can drive up the price of various fuel and also commodities, wheat, corn, whatever have you, artificially. And so that's a lot of what is driving the cost of things in our economy, and that can be regulated, and we should be pushing for regulating that on the right. Now, if you want to get rid of speculation and usury, of course you're going to have the usual suspects screaming bloody murder about it, but that should be just a core position for the right, is to get rid of these things that are contributing absolutely nothing to society. And I don't buy any of the arguments about speculators smoothing things out or what have you. Get rid of these middlemen who are doing nothing but skimming off the top and driving up prices and causing problems for everyone else, and you will see significant improvement virtually across the board. And that is an issue that would bring many people on board with the right. And that's an issue people can understand because you can explain it to them. I want to lower your grocery bill. I want to lower your food bill. I want to lower your fuel bill. I want to make your life better in an appreciable way and in the near future, because this isn't something that if you change the laws and get rid of these individuals, that this benefits people 10 years hence. No, this benefits people tomorrow if you actually do this.
Oh, wait, no, I have a question on this real quick. Now, give me on speculation. Can you, my tendency is to disagree for my own reasons as a speculator, but, but I'm not totally closed to the idea. But could you give an indication of what you might think of, like, if you were looking to curb speculation given the tool set that's available now? And I do think, especially in certain sectors, it's probably necessary, but what would that look like? How would you do that?
How about we revisit speculation in relation to this in a moment, because I did say that we would get to Mr. Burden's comments specifically dealing with regulation, energy prices, the previous topic, and then we'll open this up as a topic afterwards. So Mr. Burden, and then we'll go back to Mr. Sandbatch's question to Mr. Mahler.
I really don't have too much more to add. I don't want to get off on a conversation on woke capital, but Larry Fink is actually an interesting person to bring up, because one of the other things we're seeing increase the price of energy is essentially funding is being denied for certain industries or extremely restricted. And so obviously if you can't get, and this doesn't mean a loan in the same way you'd get a loan on your house, obviously, but essentially businesses run off of loans, right? Even things like, oh, hey, we need to pay payroll this month. We're short, $36,000. We'll take a loan for 3 days and pay it back, right? Like, that's incredibly common in business, and especially with longer term projects. And obviously there are different ways for businesses to raise capital, but on that kind of like large institutional scale, a lot of it comes from, major banks and major kind of holding houses like that, if not directly, then indirectly rather. And so I think that that's another thing. And I don't want to get on a digression about that, but that's another thing to address, is that just like the input prices when it comes to capital has gotten much more difficult and much more expensive, as well as kind of the risk of embarking on an endeavor. And like I said, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but that is, I guess, kind of a coda on what I had to say.
Alrighty. So, Mr. Sandbatch, you previously asked a question to Mr. Mahler dealing with speculation. If you would like to give a quick summary again, just so that we can recenter back on that frame of thought, we will continue down that until we switch to the next topic.
Well, right. I mean, I think it's going to depend really hard on how you define speculation. I think there are especially strong arguments especially in wheat markets and in corn markets, for the idea of, added liquidity, which is essentially what speculation is. It makes the market considerably more liquid, and the offering of essentially futures contracts as insurance policies against crop failure or exogenous shocks. I think I am pretty convinced by arguments for the utility of something like this, but I'm not closed to the idea of say preventing hedge funds from getting 10-20x leverage and swamping the market. But I am curious as how, because this is an endemic problem with having a market economy, is how do you define what speculation actually is as opposed to responsible investing, and what can you do to encourage one and curb the other? So I was just curious, speculatively, how what would an agenda for doing so look like? I'm curious.
So we'll keep this discussion very sort of strictly moderated, because this could be a whole discussion that lasts 3 hours in and of itself. So Mr. Mahler, if you could give your comments, and then we will try to not dwell too much on this topic, because I don't want this to run until noon. Mr. Mahler.
That is a fair point. foundationally, I'm not actually particularly fond of markets. I think that they are abused tools. I think that they've been set up as a false god. Because a market fundamentally is a tool. And you use a tool when it is fit for purpose. You do not use a tool simply because you like it. You may have a favorite hammer. You're not going to use it to hoe in your garden. That would be dumb. But we've sort of set up markets as this solution to everything. If we just create a market in X, Y, and Z, it will solve all of our problems. And I've even seen people argue that we could create markets for things like infrastructure, which is just absolutely mad. Am I going to have 5 companies competing for which one is going to run a road to my house and they'll all run one? It just doesn't work. There's such a thing as a natural monopoly, and it seems like many who advocate for markets have forgotten that that is a thing. And almost all utilities are natural monopolies. And that's, again, we're getting back into why regulation administrative agencies are necessary. But if you want to regulate speculation, harmful speculation in the market, my goal would just be to get rid of all of it. And so you use any tool at hand in order to get rid of it, to decrease it. And so you could start off by, say, making it so only natural persons are allowed to invest in futures. Just get rid of all of the various malefactors who are currently investing billions and using, or even tens of billions, to drive up prices artificially and then crash them and cause all sorts of problems. You could require that anyone who is investing in these futures to be set up for actual physical receipt of the product in which the person is investing. That also significantly limits those who are going to be involved in this. So there are a lot of different tools you can use in order to decrease speculation in an economy. You can also cap the return on various things. This basically is just a ban on usury, or at least limiting it. I would prefer to ban it, but that's a long-term goal. So, any tool to hand. Just attempt to decrease the amount of speculation in the economy, basically make it a real economy instead of just a bunch of spreadsheet numbers that mean absolutely nothing and have no correlation to reality, which is more or less what we have today. And I say that as someone who kind of likes Excel. I mean, the Mac version, because Excel is horrible. But still, I don't have a problem with looking at the actual data and proceeding forward from that. And you've both mentioned that you like data. If you really like data, then you would really like German regulators because they are big on modeling. But you use the information to achieve a proper end. It's not just information for the sake of information. And so I would do whatever it takes to decrease these problematic behaviors in the market.
Alrighty, Mr. Sandbatch, provided that there isn't any glaring thing that you need answered there for this brief excursion into speculation. This could be a topic for like next week's stream if I can't come up with anything. We could discuss regulation,
Right.
speculation, and all this other stuff.
I think that was a good TLDR, and there was some interesting stuff in there. I don't totally disagree with all of it either, but no, that question was answered perfectly and succinctly.
Alrighty, so yeah, next week we might be discussing these things along with more discussion on net neutrality. Of course, I would have to bring in I'd bring in an opposing viewpoint to both of you, just so that we don't, so that we can get a lot more of the topic explored. So now back on to West Virginia versus the EPA and all the implications thereof. What I would like to talk about now, and I hinted at this in the description, and you guys have been talking about it in brief in a few other of the conversations, and I think that we'll let this discussion run for quite a long time, and that will be the end of the discussion, because I think we've exhausted it almost. Environmentalism, conservationalism, the right wing, regulations in the state, and the left wing. How do these things all relate? Is environmentalism just the domain of the left wing? Was it co-opted, and was it originally the right wing? Yeah, we can explore this conversation for quite a long time, but for now, let's limit it to about half an hour or so, and then I believe we will close out. And I would like to start, though, with Mr. Sandbatch and just let the floor be open after that, because I have a feeling that Mr. Sandbatch could provide quite a strong historical perspective to start off the conversation. So, Mr. Sandbatch.
Well, environmentalism, there's a split between the word environmentalism and conservationism. that has kind of developed. And actually, one of my first jobs was working for a right aligned conservation association. But environmentalism, and I'm taking this broadly to mean both right now, is essentially a right wing concept in origin. If you go look at the early environmental thinkers, they are almost all right wing. But that has sort of shifted again. There's this period that I'm always talking about, which is the early '70s. And in the early '70s, one of the things that did happen was that the new left perceived the environmental movement, especially the environmental movement as it grew out of the concepts around the German Green Party, which of course was actually founded by a bunch of former, I don't know if you can say that word on YouTube, but there has been a strong shift since the 1970s, specifically through the person of Petra Kelly, who was kind of parachuted into Europe and ended up in a really strange, suspicious murder-suicide with a former German general. But she was a really sort of garden variety, early second wave feminist type person, and she did about as much as anybody did to sort of glue a left-wing political agenda to the idea of environmentalism. So, that's what sort of the basic mechanism that we've seen for environmental policy that emerged out of the 1970s is largely a result of that. From the perspective of today, I do think right-wing thinking needs to become way more environmental, and really not even environmental. I would prefer to say ecological, because this kind of grabs the speculation problem, and it grabs the energy problem, and it grabs a lot of things. I think if the right can manage to sort of revamp the way it thinks about the entire system of the world in terms of ecology or environmentalism, then I think that's a real good direction for us to go. So we start to conceive of the economy, the energy sphere, and all of these other facets of environmentalism that haven't necessarily been stuck directly onto it. Then we have a framework that we can sort of use to build a coherent policy agenda in both the public and private sphere. And that's kind of my take on that specific query.
Yeah, you'll have to forgive me. I'm using a laptop, so I just shortly disconnected there. Anyways, do continue. Hopefully, I didn't miss too terribly much.
So I really agree with you Sandbatch. To me, I think the issue is kind of twofold, which is one, I think that at least in the U.S., really since FDR, and then very much so after World War II, it seems to me like the right has existed exclusively as a negative force, right? So not whatever they're doing. There's been no kind of generative power on the right. And I think that a lot of the reaction to what you're talking about of like the post 70s environmental movement is a reaction to something that is genuinely unhuman, right? So like, for instance, you look at people like Extinction Rebellion, and that's kind of an extreme example, but it kind of works. And these people have kind of an odd millenarian like Gnosticism to them, right? Like the end of the world is nigh. Humans are inherently dirty, terrible beings, and we have to kind of, free ourselves from the flesh. So you see this with a lot of, the hardcore anti-natalism and a lot of the essentially like willingness to, if something's got to go, it's going to be people, if that makes sense. And so I think there's a natural distaste people have towards that, right? It's kind of creepy on one hand, and also just kind of, it seems unhealthy. And I think that's a short-term and understandable reaction. But I completely agree with you in the sense that kind of making that distinction between conservation and ecology, or ecologicalism, whatever you want to say. And so I feel like if we look at the real, like the wins of conservationism, one of the great examples is actually my home state of Virginia. So essentially by the 1930s, there were essentially no white-tailed deer left in Virginia. Between hunting and farming and getting rid of, just ruining the whole ecosystem, they were gone. But essentially through a very long-term project, and also essentially getting hunters and farmers involved in that, they've now the population is rebounded. There are essentially more deer now than there were, when the settlers arrived at Jamestown. And I think that that kind of long-term view where, and again, to use a term I normally hate, but it's quite applicable, kind of getting the stakeholders involved, so instead of, the kind of like horrible blue-haired dysgenic freak, yelling at you to never have children and ruin your life, you know, you have this kind of system where it's like, look, like we're making something for, you and your, your patrimony, your lineage, right? And I think that's an inherently right-wing idea. So that's a long way of saying I agree with you.
Okay. Now, well, one thing real quick before we kick this back out to somebody else. The deer. Okay, that's a very specific. I talked about the alligator guard, but the deer. This is a real good one. Okay, so this kind of this is an example of what the right's problem with environmentalism is kind of right now. Okay, you are correct. There are more white-tailed deer right now, especially in the eastern United States, than there ever have been before. This is a result of a lot of government wrangling in the 1950s, actually, which was the golden age of American hunting and American outdoor life, when a lot of World War II veterans were coming back and they still wanted to shoot stuff, so they had to go shoot deer. So we had to create essentially an ecosystem that had more deer for them to be able to shoot in. Okay, there's a tendency on the right to want to think of nature as something that happens. Okay, it's like, so nature is out there, we shouldn't be screwing with nature or something like that. Okay, now the fact that there are more deer and more trees in the United States right now than there ever have been before especially deer, are in part a function of the fact that we have actually already engineered our ecology so completely that the reason there's a deer bloom is because there's been a very small it's pretty significant, but in the macro terms, not a huge decline. There's been a decline in the number of hunters that have allowed deer to start breeding, and there's been a removal of predator species, particularly wolves and cougars. Okay, so you have to deal with the thing the right has to come to terms with like right now, maybe last week, is that all of the ecosystems, the entire American ecosystem, and arguably the entire world system, is already so engineered and so regulated that the only way out of this is through. You can't just say, no, we're not going to mess with that anymore, because then you end up with these situations like we have now, where the ecology of a specific system gets so out of whack that now there's too many deer, and like farmers are running over them, and they've got that disease that kills them, the wasting disease. We're too far into this project of regulating the environment to turn back on it now. So the only way out of this one is to come up with a positive vision and apply it.
Well, I agree with you. And what's interesting is that my state in particular, it's kind of, we're going through that process now, right? So the wolves in my state were gone for 80 years, plus or minus. And again, it's been slow going because, they're predators and they don't reproduce particularly quickly. But as they were kind of reintroduced from other stock on the East Coast, we've kind of seen them, obviously it's harder to have wolves in a built up area, right? Like not as easy as a deer. No one wants a 90-pound wolf running around their playground. But that said, like we have kind of seen that process at least start to work, is that as we've seen, the introduction of more predators and then also larger grazers like elk, we have at least seen some positive development.
Frequently, despite opposition on the right, is one of these things that, like, whenever the classic environmental case here, it's the ranchers versus the wolf population out in Oregon, where the hippies in Portland want to reintroduce wolves everywhere, and the ranchers in Eastern Oregon want to shoot them every time they get reintroduced or something like that. That is, this is the kind of right-wing environmental stance that I think is totally untenable at this stage in the game. Like there must be a positive, constructive vision for ways to regulate our environment, because we have already gone so far beyond the pale of like just it just comes in cycles, it comes and goes in cycles. No, these cycles have been interrupted so drastically that they now require near constant maintenance, and the right has to come up with a framework for this.
When it comes to the issue of environmentalism, conservationism, whatever it is we want to call it, we have to start with what is our foundational view of man's relationship to nature, to the environment, and then what is our philosophical approach to it. And so I think I would start with, for the former, for our foundational view, we can go to Genesis 1:28, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And so our foundational view is that we have dominion. We are in control of this planet to the degree we exercise that control and are able to do so according to our level of technology, industrialization, etc. But we are properly stewards of creation. That gets into the more philosophical side. But then, of course, we have the philosophical comment that's been part of many cultures since ancient Greece, even. Societies wax great when old men plant trees in the shade of which they know they will never rest. And so, our fundamental, foundational goal has to be to leave things better than they were left to us. Now, in our case, that may not be so difficult, since immediately prior generations have done a great job of making them worse than they ever were before, with some few exceptions like the restoration of forest, although that's been done largely over the objections of the older generations on our side. And so part of this is just a practical matter. Once the boomer generation is no longer politically empowered, a lot of these problems go away, because millennials and younger, Gen X is kind of a mixed bag on this issue, but millennials and younger have less of a problem seeing our relationship to nature as one, at least on the right, as one of stewardship, as one of we are supposed to protect and preserve and improve these things for future generations, not just exploit them, do as we please. Because to some degree, the boomer generation had sort of the ancient legal view of the relationship to land, although the ancient view, it wasn't as destructive then, because you couldn't just completely destroy all of your property in one generation. It was that you owned everything. This is the old, I won't use the Latin, but it's the old maxim from property law that you own everything all the way from your property down to hell and up to heaven. And that the old maxim, basically, you could do whatever you wanted with this bit of property because it was yours. And that is sort of the prevailing view for prior generations on the right. And that's changing. That's not the view of millennials and younger. It's not, well, it's mine, I can do whatever I want. No, it's not. You don't get to just chop down all of the 80-plus-year-old trees because, well, I own them and I can do whatever I please. No, you're supposed to preserve these things for future generations. As was mentioned, it's the patrimony, which is a term that makes people just go insane these days. But it's true. These are the things that you pass on to future generations. It is important that on the right, we make this one of our issues, not one of the left's issues. Their version of environmentalism is insane, and we have to oppose that, because their version is basically that mankind is some sort of horrible virus and disease on the planet, and that we're going to destroy everything, and so man has to go away. Which is great for us, because if we can make them just look insane, as they are, then whatever we propose in the alternative is rational by comparison. But for our stance on environmental issues, it has to be that we are stewards and that we are caretakers. Stewards because it was granted us by God, caretakers because all that we hold in trust for those who will come after us.
So Mahler, that reminded me of something you said earlier, right? And this is kind of a long callback, but you were talking about kind of the being in the looting stage of a civilization. And I think that is kind of one of the problems we have with democratic governance, right? Is that if you're only there for 4 years, your incentive structure is radically different, right? Like this is a Hoppian point, but he's not the guy who kind of originated it. If you only have 4 years to reward your friends, and that's your primary concern, well, that's what you're going to do. And I think that idea, and also the idea that you spoke to of kind of, cutting down the 80-year-old trees because gosh darn it, they're mine and I want to get my money while I can, right? Like that's kind of coming from the same like radically individual perspective of essentially all that matters is my here and now. A kind of like radical, like generational selfishness, which the boomers are on one hand kind of, they're kind of known for. But I think it's a wider problem with kind of breaking what has been called like the chain of being, that kind of tradition that links one generation to the other. And I think we've seen that obviously ecologically, but also, how the economy is treated and how politics and kind of the spoils system is treated. So that's just something that I was noticing. There's some kind of through line there.
Let me put a specific face again, because I love specific examples on the kind of thing that I'm talking about. The red snapper fishery is an important, arguably it's an important national security issue. And it has been since really the 1890s. It's been the off season when the cod season up in New England ends. The fishing ships would come south and they would spend usually I think it's the summer. They would troll for a red snapper, and ultimately what's happened in the last 30 years or so is that fishing techniques have gotten so, and cod reproduce much more quickly than red snappers do. And so there's been this issue where specifically New England fishing fleets have been able to come down, and because of the way water stock is regulated, they've been able to come down and throw money at southern state governments and throw money at federal lobbyists, and they've been able to almost eliminate the recreational limit for red snapper fisheries, and they've been able to jack up the commercial limit for red snapper fisheries, with the effect that the red snapper population plummeted over the course of 100 years. It plummeted by about 96%. And the one of the things that was started a couple of years ago was an attempt on the part of all of the states that border the Gulf of Mexico, and these are all red-leaning states with all red-leaning state governments. So it's Florida. What are they? Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. And they attempted to get together and form a league in a way of Gulf states that were going to form a sort of secondary regulatory body, or a league of states that set the policy for how the fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico were going to be, regulated. If you want to make a port of call in the state of Texas or in the state of Louisiana or something like that, you're going to have to abide by the regulations that we have imposed. And this was scuttled by essentially right-wing elements inside the United States. I mean, inside this, I think it was Louisiana. I think it was us that did it. And Louisiana was definitely the weak link there because it's the most libertarian of those states, and it's the most prone to being able to be bought out. That's an example of the kind of environmental and ecological regulation that I think needs to be had. We need to devolve as much authority as we can into bodies that are going to be primarily affected by the outcome. So that's an example of something that I thought was a great idea that was essentially scuttled from the right that we can no longer afford to do.
Alrighty. We'll give this about 5 more minutes. We'll get a couple of comments from the chat to discuss very quickly, and then we'll sign out, I believe. So, Mr. Mahler, Mr. Burden, if you two have anything to add on this topic, by all means speak, and then we will move on to the chat.
No, and this might be a tenuous connection, but I know that Mahler and Turnip, you're both Protestants as well, And there's this trend on the right, and I think it is because there is this kind of like reactionary mindset, and it's this idea that like, well, this stick has been used against us, or this thing has been used against us. This thing has been distorted. So we just need to throw up our hands, stand up at the table and leave, but that doesn't really stop our opponents from, they're still playing the game. They're still making moves if we've left the table. And so I think that it's useful to say, okay, well, the way, conservation, ecology, the EPA has been used has hurt us. We can recognize that, and that's important to recognize. But it's stupid, it's short-term thinking to kind of look at this and say, all right, well then we want the exact opposite. We want to live on a dust bowl, burn it all to the ground, because that's the opposite of what our opponents think. And I think that my connection to Protestantism is I think that you see people look at Protestantism like that, right? Like, oh, this hypothetical, trans, 3-armed pastor from the Northeast. That means, therefore, all Protestants are X, and it's kind of the similar, like, unfair way of thinking. And I think that we kind of need to treat the environment and ecology the same way, and that look like you can't just throw something out because our opponents use it sometimes. That's stupid. You leave yourself open. And I think that if we're going to play the game, we're going to have to address issues like this, because this isn't just something made up. It isn't that someone sat up, one night and said, I know, I'll trick everyone into thinking that resources are finite and that pollution affects people. That's going to be my in. And don't get me wrong, I think that there are things that are, shall we say, exaggerated. I won't say what, but I think that this is a problem that needs to be addressed by the right and by our friends.
Alrighty, Mr. Mahler, we'll let you wrap this up. I believe you have something of your own that you might want to share as well related to the topic, and then we will go to the chat. Mr. Mahler.
Well, I have quite a few things related, but I will hold off on some of them because they open up rather a can of worms. I will mention it but not go into it. The elephant in the room is, of course, the third world when it comes to environmental issues. I've commented on that before. The thing that I just linked is that it's not that the left are hypocrites, and then the subtitle for that is rather unkind but warranted. It's that you're a moron. And that is what it comes down to for the right, because the left are still playing the game, and they will keep playing the game because they are playing to win. And for them, and we have to not forget this is vitally important to remember, politics is everything for many on the left. And even for those for whom politics isn't everything, it is of equal importance to everything else in their life. Because what happens if those on the left lose politically? They lose everything. Yes, we can also lose everything, but we actually have important things in our lives, things that actually matter. We have our religion, we have our families, we have actual things in which we believe, things that are tangible, mean something. The left just have their little constructed reality based on their politics and their perversions. And so they are going to play the game to win because the game for them is their life. And the right doesn't play the game to win. Not everyone on the right has to be involved in politics in the way that everyone on the left is, but at the very least you have to support those on the right who stand up and take a leadership role, or else you are just going to have an empty chair at the table and the left will run the board.
Alrighty, and I think that will work very well to end that discussion. So, we have being as we're live this time, being as YouTube hasn't just suppressed us, we have quite a lot of feedback from the chat. Mr. J. Ford earlier had, hearkening back to some of our earlier topics about an hour ago, said, right now there's a problem with the auditability and knowledge gap between the government and corps and the people. This means that people in the whole don't know what information the government has on them. This ignorance is a form of control. Opening up this information will cause more drive for more proper regulation and auditing. And he goes on, the people who still operate as the power base for democracies are currently feeling quite out of control over the representatives. Auditing political promises is not currently possible. So we will let each member of our panel here have a very brief comment on all of that. You can find it in the chat if you need it. So first off, I might just make the point. I don't know that the people are the power base in a whatever system we're in. I don't know if you can still call it democracy if ever it was one, nor do I know if that necessarily exists. That's going to be my sort of stereotypical comment now, and I will just let whoever wants to speak up and comment on it. Make sure it is brief.
I personally
else
don't
wants
have
to-
anything to add.
Go ahead. Oh, okay. I was going to say, if no one else wants to comment, of course I will comment. But I would have to agree with the brief remarks. I don't believe democracy is a thing. Democracy can't be a thing. It's mathematically impossible. It's logically impossible. Those arguments are somewhat long and complicated, but they hold. All you do with a democracy is conceal who actually wields the power. That's the whole goal. The entire goal of a democracy is to have this facade in front of the actual power, and that way, when something goes wrong, or more likely, when those in power do something that those governed do not like, the facade gets attacked and never the actual power. And so, can you actually audit the political promises? No, for a number of reasons. One, the system is complicated in a way that makes it impossible to determine whether the individual actions of an individual actor actually contributed to the outcome. I mean, yes, you can do what some organizations do and compare voting records on various things and assess whether they are voting consistently with various principles, gun control or what have you. But even then, there is a lot of interpretive work such that the average person reading those materials has to rely extremely heavily on the ideology and the trustworthiness of the organization producing that document. Because if you have a 1,000-page bill and someone just votes yes or no, that tells you very little about what that person believes and very little about what that person is actually attempting to achieve, whether he is following through with his political promises or not. It's just, you can't really do it in our system. And that harkens back to an earlier comment. That's why you want a form of government where those making the decisions are actually invested in the outcome, which is just not the case in our form of government.
Alrighty, and Mr. Sandbatch, any brief comments from you? Mr. Sandbatch?
Oh yeah, just to clarify, and you can probably intuit this from the way that I prevaricate on questions sometimes. I am in fact an Anglican. So I think we still count as Protestants. Now on that specific, the question. Now I think this question harkens a bit to my data obsession. So there is very truly a knowledge gap between what data people have available to them, and what they know that is available to them. I don't really have a lot of comments on whether or not democracy, capital D democracy, is viable or desirable. But I do think that one of the very important things that we have to be able to come up with, moving forward, is a way to democratize this information, and because they do make it public. They make this information available. It's perfectly possible in a way that it never has been before. If you go back to the 1970s, those spreadsheets that the data tables that governments produce and everything, you need a physical copy of it. You need there's all kinds of barriers between people who might want to create alternative policies and the government agencies that are engaged in doing so, or the think tanks that are engaged in doing so. Whether or not you believe in democracy, I don't know, but I think it is more possible now than ever to be able to build a coherent response to government policy, because it's more checkable now than it ever has been. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think this is generally a positive development and one that we can build on.
Alrighty. We have this gentleman with the Asian characters in the name criticizing, I believe, Mr. Mahler's take on net neutrality. I will not open this up to the panel. I will just hint that this will possibly be discussed in a future stream dealing specifically with these kinds of regulations and right-wing strategy to it. However, relating to Mr. Mahler's comments on, let me see if I can find it. Let me see. Relating to Mr. Mahler's comments on environmentalism, I will open this up to Mr. Mahler first, and then anyone else that wants to discuss it. This gentleman here is saying, my great-grandfather plants trees hoping his family can harvest them and better their position. Here comes Mahler, herder, they're old, they belong to everyone. Now, I believe this might be a very uncharitable characterization of what you were saying, Mr. Mahler. Perhaps you would like to elaborate somewhat, and then we can open this up to the rest of the panel. Mr. Mahler.
There's a world of difference between saying that something is held in trust for future generations, for one's patrimony, for one's, well, in the case of for those who will inherit one's patrimony, and saying that it belongs to everyone, that something is a public in the grander sense of the term good. Just because you should not cut down your 50-year-old orchard doesn't mean that you have to let everyone who wants to come on your property and take apples do so. Those are two very different things. The older generations have been of the opinion, I got mine, screw everyone else. And that is the problematic position, the ideology that I would attack. They should be holding that in trust for their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, their great-great-great-grandchildren, out to however many generations an apple tree happens to live, which can be quite a few, or whatever it happens to be that you have inherited from those before you. If you are destroying these things, you can't regenerate some of them in a generation, or it'll take an entire generation. So if you destroy the things you have inherited, you are destroying the future of your own children. You are destroying the very thing that should be the top of your priority to protect. I am not saying that we have to make everything public, because then you get into the tragedy of the commons, but of course there's also the tragedy of the anti-commons, which is the one that no one ever bothers to read. But I don't agree with the characterization of my position, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying preserve things, don't just recklessly and needlessly destroy.
Alrighty. Does anyone else on the panel have anything to comment? And just to make sure that I'm not misinterpreting, I'm a very plain person. I like very plain language. This is more the position that the boomers shouldn't be, taking any saved up money that they have and blowing it on vacations and all this other stuff that can't be passed on to their children after they die. This is the viewpoint that they should be saving it and passing it on in hopes that their future generations might be able to prosper and build wealth. Is that an unfair characterization?
No, that's fair. Don't kick your children out when they're 18 just because they turned 18, and don't buy the $250,000 motorhome when your children could really use a house.
Alrighty. So, now that we have it in my very Oklahoman plain language, does anyone else on the panel have anything to add?
I don't in particular. I think that I don't know. Obviously, I know, Ryan, that you're at least in some sense more on like the I hate to use this term, but more on like the libertarian side of things, at least like from what I've heard with you and Radlip, right? And so coming from that tradition myself, right? And I'm kind of in an uncomfortable position with it. It's hard to kind of, I guess, come to a comfortable position, about like, well, what is the appropriate, use of property? What is the appropriate use of money? Can we come to some kind of societal conclusion about like, well, this is the point at which, you exercising your right to property, create some kind of externality, and that's a difficult problem. And so like, I guess my point is not that I have anything to like definitive to say, but just like there's a conversation that needs to be had there. And it's not inherently like commie talk, to say that you have economic obligations outside of just, your own personal profit. I think that that's a pretty narrow reading of it. And I think that if you kind of pick your head up and look outside of, I don't know, really the last 150 years, I think that you realize that the tradition we're attached to has a place for that.
Right. And before I get to you, I would just like to, I would like to say, I don't know that I would necessarily call myself a libertarian, and I don't think that I had for quite a while. I think I only used that label probably when I was in 8th grade or something like that, because it was new and it didn't necessarily have the connotations that it has now. Rather, what I was usually drawn to in the beginning was the more, it seemed much more what it was being described as back in 2016, at least online with the people that I was hanging out with, was that libertarianism, as it was understood, seemed to have a lot more coherence with things like common law tradition, things that were not necessarily strictly non-interventionist from an authority, but that weren't also invasive and destructive of I believe ancient rights would be the thing that would have been most commonly used. So that is a tradition that I do definitely come from. It's just also it can be interpreted, not even misinterpreted, in 4 million different ways. And I'm not even sure that people that would describe themselves as libertarians even know fully what it would entail or mean to them. So, with that being said, I tend to talk about a lot more topics that normal libertarians would not talk about. If you do consider me to be a libertarian, so that's the reason why I wouldn't necessarily use that grouping if I were you, just because it's I don't necessarily fit it too terribly well. Anyway.
And that's fair. I didn't mean to say the L word. I was mostly just
no,
going
it's
off
not.
of
I'm not
little
going to be
bit, like a
scared of
summary of your
language.
work.
Anyways, Mr. Sandbatch.
Yeah, on the 80-year-old apple tree, which is apple trees live. They can live. I think the oldest apple tree in the world died a couple of years ago, and it was like 150 years old or something like that. On the question of 80-year-old trees and that sort of thing, though, the ancient common law, and I'm trying to like pronounce the ancient. It's ancient with a Y. The ancient common law position on something like that is that, I mean, this returns to what in the English tradition is called the improved land. The improved land issue. And so generally what we would say is that if you have squirreled away enough land that you own like 3 counties worth of land or something like that, you if you are not actively improving some aspect of this land, like if you haven't submitted building permits, or you aren't like staking out, if you haven't like surveyed and staked out some area, that you do have a hard time telling people that they can't come get apples from your orchard, and that cutting at that point, you haven't done enough with this land that's nominally yours to destroy the common the common usage of it. So no, you can't get mad at people coming to take apples on your apple orchard that's 1.5 miles from your actual house that you haven't done anything with, and you can't just go cut those trees down because you're tired of people coming on your property to get apples. That's actually what the ancient the really old common law position is on this question. So that's
right.
Just to clarify it.
Right, and that's why
or less the position in Europe. For instance, you have what's called Allemannsretten in what is that? That's Norwegian. Anyway, it's one of the Scandinavian languages, and essentially that is used largely for hiking and camping, but it could be used for things like apple trees growing in the wild or berry bushes, and that's that there is a general right of all citizens to travel through and even usually stay on, but only for a limited time, like one night or so, undeveloped land. And that means no, they can't come and camp in your manicured backyard, but if you have 40 acres behind your house that is just forest, they are permitted to hike through that or even camp there for a night. And that is a more traditional view of things. The putting up of the fences everywhere and saying that, no, I own this 300 acres of forest that I have never even walked through in my life and no other man may ever see my trees. That is a very weird, novel, recently developed position.
Right, and what I was going to say before that was the reason that I'm so drawn to common law is that I'm not necessarily, let me rephrase that, I'm not at all against authority or hierarchy, but what I am against, and this is where I will probably disagree with Mr. Mahler and Mr. Sandbatch, is I tend to dislike a lot of the modern bureaucracy and the things that even led to the modern bureaucracy. So whenever I read back to common law tradition, and I see that you had typically, counties and shires organized with very local very local authorities that also had a vested interest in making sure that people developed their land and kept it, not sacred, but held in very high regard for their next generations. That's something that draws me to that tradition. It seems to me to be a very good balance of non-interventionism and also responsible governance by an authority that isn't intrusive. Once again, though, that's where I would disagree, and that is a topic for a different time. Does anyone else have anything to add about the comment that we started this on? Because if
I'm
not,
just going
I
to
think we will...
correct myself real quickly. That's Swedish, not Norwegian. So in case any Scandinavians get weird in the comments, I've corrected it. You're not that different anyway, so don't get too weird about it.
Mr. Sandbatch, Mr. Burden, anything else on this specific topic?
I just have one thing to say to end all Nordic infighting in the comments, and that is that Finland is my favorite Scandinavian country, and I have nothing else to say on the matter.
Mr. Sandbatch?
Well, I had a comment on the Scandinavian thing too, which is that I have, in fact, I made in a blog post once, I made a very offhand comment about something that I thought was something that happened in Norway. It was in like the 11th footnote of a Substack article, and a Swedish guy messaged me on Telegram, and I was like, I didn't think anybody read the footnotes to anything, but of course Scandinavians read footnotes, and Sweden was offended that I had credited Norway with one of their accomplishments. So they really do be like that.
Alrighty. Being as that topic is now closed, we will now do last remarks, and then we will sign off. So we will start this time. I believe that we went Mr. Burden, Mr. Sandbatch, and Mr. Mahler. This time, Mr. Mahler, do you have any closing remarks about any of the subjects that we have covered?
I think the real takeaway from this and related issues is that the right needs to stop just ceding ground to the left. What we've largely done is anytime the left comes along and sticks their flag in the ground, however many colors it happens to have that week, the right just abandons that position and lets the left have that territory. Oh, well, they've said it's theirs. We can't possibly do anything. And so the left started taking over the environmentalism issue decades ago, and largely the baby boomers on the right just abandoned the issue because how the left did it was they found the craziest people in the environmentalism movement, the ones who like to go and firebomb SUV dealerships and other things like that, chain themselves to trees, which isn't necessarily always wrong, but these people do it all the time and for no reason, and they'll do it with new growth. But if you pick those people and then let them become the face of environmentalism, yes, you are going to have some people who recoil from that, but the solution isn't to completely abandon the issue. The solution is to go, no, those are not environmentalists, those are mental patients. Those people are crazy, that's not what we believe. Here's what we actually believe. Here's why we believe it. So instead of just abandoning the issue because the left has staked a claim, we have to propose an alternative. We have to be active, not passive. Not just sit back and go, oh, well, we won't do X, Y, and Z, because just like I mentioned before, if you say we won't do X, Y, and Z, that's just signaling to your opponents how they can win. And so the right has to be active. You don't win in politics by saying what you won't do. You win in politics by saying what you will do. Yes, there can be things that you refuse to do, lines you refuse to cross, but you don't focus on those. You focus on the things that you are going to do, particularly the things that have a concrete effect on your constituents, on those you want to support you.
Alrighty. Mr. Sandbatch, do you have your closing remarks?
Closing remarks? No, I think I've probably said everything that I needed to say, which is just that, I think this is a very specific, the original topic of this stream is a very specific, narrow ruling that does have some implications for, really, I think, the way the different political sides are going to be able to, wrangle and be able to dish out contracts to one another and that sort of thing. But it's a really narrow ruling. But I have enjoyed the rest of the talk about ecological policy and that sort of thing. But I don't think I really need to sum it up again, because I don't think I don't think there's a lot of disagreement. We all seem to be more or less in agreement on a lot of the key issues.
Alrighty, Mr. Burden, your closing remarks, comments, however you want to call them.
I'm going to kind of echo Sandbatch here. I thought this was a really interesting stream. I feel like I was able, at least personally, to kind of verbalize something that had been bouncing around in my head. And so going back to kind of like the core point of this stream, I don't have too much more to add on the Supreme Court ruling. Obviously, it is kind of the exclamation point at the end of a series of pretty fast blows. And so I think it's kind of hard to say, where those will develop. At least personally, I'm kind of watching to what degree these things will be enforced, but I guess there's not too much more to say for me.
Alrighty, and with that being said, I have linked everyone's linked Jay Burden's YouTube channel, where he interviews various people on the right wing. That is in the description. Mr. Sandbatch's Esoterica Americana Substack has been linked in the description, and Mr. Mahler's Corey J. Mahler, is it .com or is it .net? I can't remember the.
It is .com.
All right, CoreyJMahler.com, where he posts his thoughts and considerations. So if I have missed any shilling, or if you guys have anything special that you need to add, please let me know now so that the audience can hear. Or if not, with that being said, I should be releasing a video very soon, hopefully in the next 2 days. I originally said that on Wednesday and had a lot of things happen in real life, also trying to set this up and rename things that prevented me from getting it released today. I will be releasing a video on a 1522 marriage sermon that I thought was quite insane, really, reading through it. It had a lot of comments that are still pertinent now, 500 years later. And as always, if you enjoy my work, if you would like to support it, in the description should be a link to my Subscribestar. All of your donations are very much appreciated. And anyone else have anything to add? And with that, I believe that we are ready to sign off. If you're in the United States, have a good rest of the morning. If you're in other parts of the world, have a good rest of the day. And I will see you all next week. Goodbye.
Goodbye.